Welcome back, Run It Once. This is Krzysztof Slasky, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. Lately, I've been getting students interested in discussing the kind of strategic adjustments to the unique format of the Chinese kind of app-based poker games. As well, there's been some Run It Once members asking for this on the forums, and as somebody who's put in a significant amount of volume in these games, I thought I would share my experiences and discuss the adjustment I was making for these games. So I'll start with a brief overview of what these games are and how they work for those of you who've never come across these games. And then we'll move on to a kind of more strictly strategic kind of technical talk. Okay, so what are these sites? I'm sure most of you have at least heard of them, if not played them. I think the biggest of these sites have at one point surpassed the volume that PokerStars is getting, which is pretty ridiculous. So what are these games? Well, they're play money applications which allow users to create private clubs and keep track of everyone's results. Essentially, since outside of Macau and Hong Kong, poker and gambling in general, I believe, is illegal in China, these applications would not be allowed to exchange real money between players or keep players' money for the purposes of gambling. And up until very, very recently, this was legal in China. However, in June of this year, which is 2018, the Chinese government instituted a kind of countrywide ban on these applications. As far as I know, they're still functioning quite well. I'm not even sure if this ban affected the volume at all. But as at the time of this video, these apps are actually illegal in China. As far as playing on these apps outside of China, and I'm going to preface this by saying I'm obviously not a lawyer, but I can't imagine it being illegal in a country where gambling is legal. Nevertheless, the fact that at origin running these apps is illegal bears some quite obvious implied risk behind it, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a second here. And to wrap it all up, these apps get used for the purpose of running games while settling the financials on the side, whether it be through WhatsApp or Link or other encrypted messaging services. Typically, an interested party will be assigned to an agent who handles all that for him, keeps track of his results, and manages the financial exchanges. So basically, you're playing in a private play money application where your results are being tracked by the club administrator and you're settling the money kind of on the side. Here's a quick general framework for how these games work. The games are timed, typically 4 to 8 hours, although sometimes they can be a little bit shorter. This is basically necessary to have some sort of point where the agents are able to track results, which would be a little difficult to do if the games were continuous. Although, obviously, from a player's standpoint, this is pretty inconvenient and it can get a little tedious. Rake is paid off your winnings at the end of each session, so there's no rake taken out of each pot, but rather it's a 5% rake taken out of your winnings once the games are, or whatever game you are playing is done. And if you have a losing session, you don't pay rake for that specific game. And the big thing here being that it's uncapped, which is obviously very significant. The 5% capped rake off of each pot is not going to equal a 5% uncapped rake off your winnings at the end of each game. But again, we'll talk a little more about this in a second here. Generally, the games involve antes as well as straddles, and they play extremely deep. You're usually allowed to buy in for 250 big blinds at least, although I've seen games that allow much deeper buy-ins than that. And the antes are typically very large. And for anybody interested in playing in these games, there are many other costs related to doing so. There's no free time banks. Every time you want to use a time bank, it costs you what are called gems, which you can purchase with your agent. They're not going to be super expensive, but it is a kind of added cost. There's a fee to buy into the games as well as to add on chips. So typically when you sit down, the application will charge you a small percentage of your buy-in, or at least that was the case when I was playing. I'm not going to remember precisely, but I believe it worked out to something like less than 0.5% of your actual buy-in, or maybe a little bit less than 1%. It wasn't very significant, but I mean, it kind of adds up over time. And there's obviously an agent fee. Every time you want to cash out, the stable or house or whatever you want to call it takes 15% of your profits. And again, this number may vary from kind of club to club. Furthermore, they might also charge you an exchange rate fee, obviously depending on what currency you decide to cash out in. So before we move on to discussing actual strategy adjustments, there's a few things that I felt needed to be addressed here. Obviously, due to the nature of this business, as well as the Play Money software, which isn't going to have the security measures that are taken by most online sites, cheating and scamming is a very regular occurrence in these games. And so right off the bat, as you get your kind of foot through the door with these games, make sure you can actually trust your agent. Ask for like a character reference or a vouch or maybe some sort of personal information on this person. You're absolutely not out of line asking your agent to validate themselves. This person is going to be handling a lot of your money and you need to be able to trust them. You're entering into a professional business relationship. Any respected kind of institution, whether it be a hedge fund or a bank, if you ask for something like this, they'll be happy to provide it. In fact, normally they'll just provide it before you even ask. So whether it be just a person you know that's been playing under this person's stable, or some kind of a well-respected person within the poker community that it would be able to vouch for this agent, make sure that he's actually a trustworthy person. Number two, beware of unconventional behavior at your tables. Generally, the way these scams are going to go down from a gameplay perspective is there's going to be a team of players sitting at the same table, either exchanging cards or trying to pump each other's pots, etc. So just make sure you're keeping an eye out for one of these things. If it seems like you're at a table that's incredibly soft, but you can't seem to win a pot, maybe take a look at the hand histories, reevaluate, make sure that you're not being scammed, and make sure you're marking these kind of teams when you do notice one, so that you're able to kind of avoid them in the future. If you have friends playing in the same clubs, that helps. You'll be able to exchange information, kind of look out for each other. Keep track of your results and compare with your tallies that you're being sent by your agent. Whether it be on purpose or by mistake. Obviously, if this is on purpose, you probably shouldn't be in that stable in the first place. But mistakes do happen. So these agents have a lot of players to keep track of, and when you're copying numbers for 50 different people in your stable, mistakes do happen. It's human nature. It's nobody's fault. And on the flip side of that, if there's an error in your favor, make sure you do mention it to your agent. You don't want to develop a relationship where your agent doesn't feel like he can trust you, or he feels like you might be scamming either himself or other players. And the last point here, don't keep a large bankroll with your agents. Cash out as frequently as you're allowed. Again, it may feel like you're a little bit out of line asking for frequent cash outs. However, these people are making a lot of money off of you. I mean, as I kind of mentioned earlier, the rake is very high. There's all kinds of costs related to this. So you're absolutely entitled to ask them to cash out your money as frequently as possible. And this is also a nice little way to see how accountable your stable is. If you're able to cash out frequently with no issues, it's probably a pretty good sign. And one more issue when it comes to keeping a lot of money with these sites is that, or with these clubs rather, is that, as I mentioned, these apps are now illegal in China. Even if your agent thinks they're safe, even if he thinks they are very unlikely to get busted or whatever, it's still going to be a very risky proposition. And you never want to be in a situation where you have a significant amount of your net worth tied up in a spot where you might not be able to retrieve it. Even if it's a very low % chance, if it's money that's important to you, it's just not worth the risk. And on that note, I wanted to share with you guys a quick little video that was shared by Run It Once user Corn1337, which, for those of you who play these games or are interested in these games, you're gonna probably want to have seen this video. This is kind of basically just showing a team working these games. You want to be aware that this is out there, how frequently it happens, and whether it happens in every club or not, I obviously can't say. And, there's a chance that the club you belong to or the club you're going to, apply to or start playing in is going to be completely safe, completely kind of scam-free. But either way, you're going to want to be on the lookout and making sure that this doesn't really happen to you. And quickly here, the very last thing I wanted to touch on, which is the implications of, a kind of original format game with a much higher rake. Games like this can be very deceptive. It's going to be tough to recognize whether you're actually winning enough to justify playing these games over your next best choice, because the kind of game theoretically correct dynamic is going to be much looser than a regular online cash game. All these things that are designed to kind of make the games more fun and more enjoyable for the recreational players, such as the straddles, the antes, the deeper stacks, also make it, again, a much looser game. So a player with stats that look weak and fishy in a regular cash game might actually be a very skilled player in a game like this. And again, because of the higher rake and all the other risks involved, such as the risk of ruin, the potential scammers, potential cheaters, all of this makes it very important that you're 100% certain that you're beating this game for enough money where, to justify playing this over your next best choice, which would be, I guess, any safe online site, which again can be a little tough to judge, especially if you're somebody who doesn't really have much experience with games like this, and this is your first time jumping into this sort of format. You're going to need a little bit of volume to really be able to realistically judge how well you're doing in these games and how soft they really are. So just keep that in mind. Make sure you're accounting for these things. Make sure that maybe you start with some lower stakes games where even if you get scammed, even if you get cheated, it's not going to be a big deal. Maybe upload a smaller bankroll on there first and try to build it up to the games you really want to be playing, or to your regular stakes, so to say. This way, maybe you're taking a bit of a hit at first, but then you're able to mitigate some of these risks. All right, so now finally moving on to some actual strategy. And this is going to apply to pretty much any deep ante kind of live sort of dynamic games, which is pretty much what the Chinese applications try to copy, basically. Let's start with game selection. As you can see, games are timed and you're paying for the buy-ins. So choose your games with plenty of time left. So to give a brief example, if a game's got half an hour or an hour left on it, it would have to be a very, very soft game to justify entering that and having to pay for your buy-in over a slightly worse game that's got, maybe 5 or 6 hours left. That being said, you are going to run across a lot of players that, as the game's kind of winding down, they don't like being stuck. They start gambling and trying to get unstuck. So, you got to keep all these things in mind. And, of course, another thing is that as the games wind down, less regulars are going to enter them. They're going to be typically softer games. But again, you're going to need some of these things to justify playing a game like that over a game with a little more time left. Second point here, you pay rake off your winnings. If you get stuck, you won't be paying any rake off your next big pot. Again, so if you're entering a game and right away you lose a couple of buy-ins, this game now becomes quite a bit cheaper for you, because for the next however many buy-ins you've lost, you're not paying any rake off your winnings. And that's somewhat significant. You can always, if the game slows down and you're kind of questioning whether it's worth sitting there still, at least on the applications I've played, you can exit a game and then come back to it, and your kind of tally for that game stays the same. So you can always just jump around, take a look at the other games, see how they're playing, and then maybe come back to your game if there's nothing else attractive. And the last point here, and this applies to any poker in general, but quite a bit more so on these very high rake games, as the regulars become quite a bit tougher to beat with higher rake. Always buy deep enough to cover the weak players, but don't worry about having to cover the regulars. So if you have a game where there's 2 recreational players sitting on 300 big blinds and 3 regulars sitting on 400 big blinds, just the 300 kind of does the trick. You don't need to try to battle the regulars for the extra 100 big blinds. It's, you're going to have a pretty significant edge over them to really make money there with this sort of rake structure. Once you're in the actual game, loosen up your ranges. There is more money to fight for. Again, as I kind of mentioned earlier, all these little structure differences for these games are designed to make it looser. Limping is very cheap and very attractive this deep. When you're sitting 200, 300, sometimes deeper with some recreational players, you're going to want to see as many flops against them as possible. Of course, that being said, this gets slightly negated with aggressive players sitting on your left. However, generally speaking, you're going to want to slap on another 5-10% of a limping strategy over top of your kind of standard ranges, and just hope to cooler some of the weaker players. Obviously, this should go without saying, but all these things are operating under the assumption that the game involves quite a few weaker players. And if it doesn't, you probably shouldn't be sitting in that game. It's very tough to beat regulars with this sort of rake structure. The third point here, looser preflop ranges equal looser postflop ranges. So you just got to stay conscious of the fact that when we open in MP2 and get called in the big blind, these ranges are going to look slightly different than they do in like a regular 100 big blinds deep online cash game. So we're going to start being able to value bet a little more aggressively. We're going to see some looser check raises, looser calls against the check raises again. And you just have to stay aware of the fact that we're going to have some combinations that maybe in a regular cash game wouldn't make it into your bluffing range. But since now you're having slightly looser ranges, this hand becomes a pretty high frequency bluff. And same going for the value bets. We're going to be barreling off slightly looser, and just got to make sure that we're getting all that value when our opponent's range is quite a bit looser than it would be without the antes or the straddles. And just a final slide before we move on to some hand histories. The whole premise behind these games and the whole reason that they attract the weaker players so much is that it's quite a bit more fun for them than some regular online cash game where they're really just sitting and then getting owned by players kind of using tighter ranges and well-defined strategies that don't involve putting a lot of money in the pot unless it's a highly profitable play. So if you want to keep these games healthy and you want to keep them going, you're really going to want to make it as fun for the weaker players as possible. Get involved in pots with them. As you can see, one of my points here says throw poop, which for those of you who've never played on these applications, there's basically an option that allows you to throw poop at another player's avatar, which I think is one of the greatest things that Chinese applications brought to poker. I think this should definitely be introduced into online poker sites. Engage the recreational players, if you do speak the language, chat with them, kind of make them feel welcome, make sure they're having fun essentially. And on top of the fact that they're having more fun, they're probably going to not mind stacking off to you. They're not going to mind playing with you. Whereas if you're the kind of tighter player sitting there, not engaging, not really looking to have fun, but approaching this from more of a business standpoint, you're probably not going to get as much action. And worst of all, you're going to contribute to driving these players away from the games, which kind of ties into my last point here, which isn't necessarily a strategy adjustment, but rather a general approach to poker thing. don't be part of the problem. You know, these games leave a lot of room for kind of abusing the system, all the kind of little things you can do to maybe tip the scales in your favor a little bit. You know, it all contributes to the issue. It's going to contribute to these games dying. It's going to contribute to poker dying in general. And, you know, kind of most importantly, they're very short-sighted strategies. You might win a little more today, but if it contributes to the game dying, to driving away weaker players, to other players maybe feeling not so great about playing poker anymore because they're worried about getting scammed or not having a good time at the games, all of that is really going to come around. I mean, the poker community, as large as poker is nowadays, really isn't that large, especially the online poker community. So the saying, what goes around comes around, really does apply here. If you're contributing to players not having fun, to players feeling like they need to scam, they need to cheat to actually beat the games, and your actions are driving away the recreational players, that's really going to eat into your future kind of potential earnings from poker. You'd really need to massively increase your short-term win rate to make up for the potential earnings you would have if you don't take the X amount of years that you're taking off of the life of online poker there. And so for that reason, I find it pretty important to kind of give a deeper thought into whether my actions are contributing to the growth of poker or to the promotion of the game, or rather to, you know, the other kind of negative side. And maybe I'm getting a little too deep into this than necessary, but a great large-scale example of this would be Full Tilt Poker, where who knows where the state of online games and even live games would be these days if these guys really thought about whether their actions are really making the money in the long term. I mean, if Full Tilt was still running, all these guys would still be pocketing a ton of rake. Anyway, let's move on to some actual hands here. Okay, so bear with me with these hands, as I don't play these games anymore, and I don't have that many of them saved rather. So I tried to pick out the ones that, in my opinion, illustrate kind of the dynamics in these games, and the things that I remember were pretty common with the application games that don't really happen that much in online games, and also some of the adjustments I was making versus these game dynamics and these players. So again, what I'm going to try to do with these hand histories is focus on the player pool specific adjustments rather than talk about more theoretical approach or how I think the strategies in these spots should be played against regulars. And I do apologize for the format of these hand histories. I'm not sure if there's any other way to actually do this. If you've never seen these before, bear with me. I'm gonna explain them. I'm gonna read them out, and hopefully by like the second or the third one, you're able to kind of keep up. So this game is 20, 40, 80 yen with a 20 yen ante, and we are in the big blind with Queen 9 of diamonds, and it's folded around to us with the under the gun or straddle player left. We raise to roughly 3.8 times the straddle, and we are about 100 big blinds or 50 straddles, whatever you want to call it, deep. And this is the sizing I'd be using in the big blind here. I might even go a little bit bigger if our opponent's a little bit deeper. Essentially, once it folds around to us, there is a lot of money to play for with these kind of small blind antes here, as well as the straddle and the dead small blind. So we want to be making this quite pricey quite costly for our opponent. On the right side here, you see more or less the range I'd be using in this situation. Again, there's just a lot of money to be played for, so we don't need these hands to be succeeding with these opens or even making a lot of money post-flop to really justify this open. And our opponent calls. So my c-betting strategy in this situation would be quite exploitable. One of the largest exploitative things that I personally noticed about these games is that players really like to raise small c-bets as a bluff. And of course it happens with value hands quite frequently as well. However, these ranges I found were quite skewed towards bluffs. So for this reason, I would exclude a bunch of these kind of smaller protection bets, such as 7s, 8s, 9s, and I would generally try to reduce the 6x combinations I'm betting in this situation. Unfortunately, in Flopzilla, I'm unable to kind of show percentages of these hands once we kind of filter for some made hands on the flop. But I certainly wouldn't bet these at 100% frequency. And that being said, the underlying assumption here is that we're playing a weaker player. So I would still put out a whole lot of these kind of equity denying / protection bets that are just meant to exploit our opponent's likely inability to call properly in this situation. From my experience, I found that there's very few players who would call hands like the King of Diamonds 10, King of Diamonds 9, stuff like that. So, because obviously I'm trying to pick out the hands that I think illustrate some of the exploitable player pool tendencies, we get raised in this situation. And the range I'm going to call is pretty much intuitive, any pair, any flush draw, any gut shot sort of thing. I would also turn a bunch of these kind of random protection bets into bluffs versus this raise. I think we can have a pretty aggressive 3-betting strategy here on this board versus a kind of lower, shorter stack. And I would probably do it with a hand as weak as Ace-King, maybe Ace-Queen. Ace-Jack would probably be my kind of threshold. There's plenty of turns here where versus a weaker player we'll be losing value, even this short stacked. I'm kind of expecting him to do this with some random Ace-10s, Ace-Jacks, Ace-9s, where he's going to stack off if we just pile over top of this raise. So we just call our Queen-9. I think jamming would be okay. I mean, honestly, we probably just get it in versus a lot of hands that we have beat, like lower flush draws, stuff like 7-8. His 4-3 in this exact example probably isn't fold if we just pile. The turn is an offsuit ace, and it goes check. And we get to the river, which is another offsuit ace. And at this point, our hand is very much strong enough to show down here. And, I mean, bluffing just doesn't make much sense. We're not going to get him off of 6x. We're not going to get him off of any random 7s or 8s if that's what he raised with. The only real hand that we can make him fold is his King X of diamonds, which we obviously block. So we're just checking, hoping to check down, and our opponent comes up with this half-pot bet sizing, which represents hands like 6x, I guess, maybe some overpairs to the 6. I think his Ace-X region just wants to go bigger than this. And even from like an exploitative standpoint, I think these players just do go bigger with their Ace-X in this situation. As for the rest of his flop value region, hands like 6s and 5s, I really can't imagine checking back the turn very much. He'll have his 6-5, which I think will play this way quite frequently. But generally speaking, I think this value range is very narrow, and I think versus players that will generally tend to be more aggressive than not, we can make some very exploitative calls here. And I think this Queen High makes for a fine one. Jack High would get a little dicey, since I think he will turn his Queen X into a bluff, and certainly 10x would just be a little too weak. But generally speaking, these are the kind of exploits you want to look for in these games. Players just kind of over bluffing in situations where they likely don't realize how narrow their value betting range becomes. This next hand, again, just trying to illustrate some of the exploits I'd be going with in these games. We have a cutoff limp, likely a weaker player, and we isolate in the big blind to 5 big blinds, or 5 straddles, whatever you want to call it. We get the straddle call, and the cutoff comes along as well. And on the right here is roughly the range I'd be doing this with. You can definitely make a case for isolating a little bit looser, like the King 8, Queen 8, Jack 8, maybe the 8-6 suited stuff. But this is kind of the ballpark of what I'd be going with. We get the 8-8 deuce rainbow flop, pretty decent for us. And I'd be going with a pretty aggressive betting frequency here. Again, as I mentioned before, I'm unable to kind of put percentages on these hands. But these are all the hands I'd be favoring betting with. I would certainly find a lot of checks with probably the aces and the kings, and maybe some of the 8x combos as well. but mostly just looking to deny equity with a pretty aggressive betting frequency. And the suited combos here that you see are going to be just the backdoor flush draw ones, of course. So we bet half pot, and we get this raise from the cutoff, and we go with the rip over top of the raise. I mean, in this specific hand, I most likely, hopefully, didn't realize that our opponent only has less than half of his stack left. I'm certainly not overly proud of this jam, but I wanted to show this hand here because it's something that you're going to come across probably fairly regularly in these games, which is kind of this blind, mindless aggression. I mean, the fact that this player finds a fold here given like more than 3-1 is pretty staggering. But regardless, I wouldn't mind jamming here with hands like maybe Ace-King that still have pretty decent equity versus his random Ace-Highs, random 3s, 4s, 5s that kind of did this to deny equity and now have no choice but to call down. Once again, similarly to the first hand we went over, I think it's a spot where it's very easy for the cutoff to overbluff. He will have pocket deuces at a very high frequency, and he'll have a bunch of kind of 8-7 suited, 8-6 suited, 8-9 suited, 10-8 suited. But he's not going to have a whole lot of offsuit 8x combos. So again, a very easy spot for a player like this to have his bluffing frequencies just kind of out of control. As I already mentioned, I wouldn't advocate doing this with a hand like King-Queen. We're probably just going to get owned by ace-highs a whole lot, and I doubt that this player will fold his ace-highs versus this raise. But within my limited arsenal of hand histories from these games, this was a kind of nice illustration of senseless aggression that you're going to see in these games. Our next hand is a 3-bet pot. We begin with a 3.5 straddle open on the button, and we get 3-bet by the straddle. For a pretty small sizing, I mean, this 270 to 820 is way too small. We're just getting a very, very good price here. For that reason, as you can see on the right side, I'm going to be defending this very wide. This is, of course, my total defend versus the 3-bet range. I'm going to be finding 4-bets with probably like a third of this range at some frequency versus this smaller sizing. It's pretty nice to be able to deny equity and just kind of scoop up the blinds and the antes here. Part of the reason why I'd be defending this loose is that I'm expecting to just kind of outplay most of this player pool post-flop and gain some pot share that way. If you're not super comfortable post-flop, you should probably cut down some of these marginal questionable hands here, specifically the offsuit combos. Anyway, so we go to the flop, and we are roughly 150 big blinds deep to start this hand. We get the 10-6-5 monotone board. And this board in general is going to be pretty passive for the out of position player's strategy. Maybe slightly looser, slightly more aggressive with this antes dynamic, but it's still going to mostly favor checking. And so I'm going to expect most of the player pool here to just be greatly over aggressive, especially with these half pot c-bets. So for that reason, you can make a pretty good argument for raising these boards very aggressively. And I think this Queen 8 or any really made flush here is going to be like a mix for me. Again, this is all very exploitable, very much targeting the player pool tendencies. I think you're going to find that most of these players will just put way too much money in here with hands like jacks through aces without a diamond, random 10x, random queen jack with a diamond, etc. When it comes to my continue range versus this bet, just very intuitive. Any flush draw, any pair, any overcards with a diamond, and of course any straight draw. Again, I'm going to repeat myself a little bit here, but you can make a good case for raising pretty much any of these hands here. And I don't think it would be a very big mistake versus this player pool. We get to the turn, which is the 3 of clubs, pretty much a brick. We face a 66% bet or so. And now I'm going to start dropping off the straight draws, the 6x hands, as well as the 5x hands, and some of the weaker flush draws, and potentially even a hand like Ace of Diamonds 9, although, I mean, that's pretty close. Not having an overcard to the 10, it does hurt the Ace 9, and also getting owned by a bunch of Ace Queen, Ace King with a diamond isn't ideal. I won't have much of a raising frequency versus this bet specifically. We're left with roughly a pot-sized bet on the river, and I think anything but a flush at this point is probably a little bit too thin to raise. I mean, you can make an argument for raising 6s and 5s, but that's a pretty small portion of our range, and also they're going to be reduced when we just call on the flop. And our flushes are just not overly concerned with letting our opponent see a card, plus picking up additional EV when he just barrels off any random river with any random 2 cards is going to kind of bring up their pot share quite a bit. We get to the river, which is the king of diamonds. Not the best card for our hand per se, but a pretty decent card for our range. I mean, looking at this, our flushes are obviously still pretty strong, and then pretty much every one of these offsuit hands that you see here has a diamond, the vast majority of them anyway, with the exception of the 10x region, or some of the 10x region anyway. We get a check from our opponent, and this is where, against pretty much every other player pool that I'm playing, I would definitely not go with this large of a bet sizing, which is 7,300 into roughly 8,600. We would certainly be isolating way too strong of a range from our opponent with this bet size if we're playing somebody who's really designing their ranges on the flop and turn very well. However, in this player pool, I think the Queen of Diamonds is just strong enough to be able to jam here. I think our opponent's going to find calls with any random diamond he has. I think he's going to find calls with ace-kings, with probably pocket aces, potentially a hand like queens or jacks. Just a whole lot of hands that definitely shouldn't be calls here, but I think they're going to find calls frequently enough to make our queen-high flushes favor the larger sizing over a smaller sizing. That being said, the queen would certainly be my threshold. I think the jack of diamonds would just be a little too weak. And unfortunately, we get a fold, so we don't get to see what our opponent had here. But generally, not the best example, but the point of this hand here was to illustrate just the general adjustment I'd be making versus the player pool, where I'd be making, slightly thin value bets for larger sizings, whereas normally, even versus weaker players, I probably wouldn't go this large. And I'm going to end the video here. Thanks for watching, guys. If you have any questions, or if you want to share your own experience with these games, anything I might have missed, anything you think is noteworthy to share with the other players, feel free to comment, feel free to message me privately. If any of you were involved with these games from the inside, if maybe you were an agent, maybe you worked for one of the clubs or the stables, and there's anything valuable that you'd be able to share, that'd be awesome. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Good luck at the tables, and I will catch you next time.